Thank you. It's a pleasure to be presenting here again. I gave another talk here about a year and a half ago, something like that.
Yep, it was.
Now, this one is about a research project that I started about 7-8 years ago with a friend of mine who is his name is Jean-Luc Gély, who is a captain in the French airborne forces, but also a great historian. And I decided to work with him because he's in France. Haven't been able to be back in France in close to 4 years now, so he can help with the research there. This is the story of a unit of the Free French Army, or I should say probably armies, that fought in North Africa during the Second World War. The lecture is called Laissez pour compte. Laissez pour compte, that's a French phrase that would refer to someone who has been pretty much kicked to the curb and abandoned because they were a unit that initially nobody wanted to touch. But they fought, and they fought hard. It's not a huge story, but I think it's an interesting one. I hope you will find it interesting because it's a unit that ended up being attached to an American infantry division, the 9th. And I'm very interested in those situations in which you have a connection between French military history and American military history, which was the case, as you recall, in my first lecture here. So, first of all, I'd like to say that I promised my wife that I would try to make it as short as possible. By the way, she was not happy with the picture that you chose for my introduction because she said that it's an official GSU picture, and she says it makes me look like a pompous, stuck-up French academic. The issue being, of course, that I am stuck-up French academic. Anyway.
Cute, so you can stay.
This is not going to be, I have a few maps, but this is not going to be a tactical history of the unit. If you're interested, read, of course, the finest books on the issue, which is Rick Atkinson's An Army at Dawn about North Africa. It's a part of his trilogy. Actually, when I started working on it, I didn't find a lot of published sources. There is one book that was written by a Romain Durand in, I think, 85. And Romain Durand was actually the son of Norbert Durand, who was a member of the Corps Franc d'Afrique. I will refer to it as CFA from now on. And he was one of the major combat officers in the Corps Franc, the CFA, and he actually had a very interesting career because he's one of the founding fathers of the French airborne forces. He's the one who started the French airborne school in Pau, where it still is located in southern France. Brilliant military career, a combat officer, and actually he died in a very stupid ambush in 1952 in Tunisia, as Tunisia was preparing to become independent from France. So anyway, you'll see that there are other men like him, people who started in the Corps Franc and then joined other form of commando units and then fought in North Africa, Indochina. I'll go back to that in a moment. So anyway, many years ago, about 10 years ago, a friend of mine, who's also a French scholar, was working on a publication project on made-up dictionaries. What he meant by made-up dictionaries is, if you haven't read it, you should. Ambrose Bierce's The Devil's Dictionary. It's a wonderful book. And I had this recollection of a book in my dad's library called The Fictionary, and actually it translates very nicely. It's Le Fictionnaire, The Fictionary, a compendium of undefinitions. That's the title of the book. And it was written by Georges Elgozi. So I called my mom and told him to send me the book. And I also started doing some bibliographic research. And he published a lot. After the war, he was in numerous governments as a sort of super administrators in various agencies. He was by training a doctor of pharmacy. And he was very much interested in something that has been tried for a long time, trying to change the profile of the French elites. And it has never worked. But he tried. But looking at his bibliography, I saw this book that I'd never heard of. It's called La vérité sur mon corps franc d'Afrique, the truth about my CFA. I said, what's the CFA? And I started doing research, and I looked at his presence in the French archives. I saw that he was a lieutenant commanding a small company in the Corps Franc d'Afrique in 1942, late 1942. And then he became a liaison officer with Allied forces. So I started digging around for information about the Corps Franc, and I found a lot of really interesting stuff, but not very much published. The Corps Franc, in what I found, was a hodgepodge unit made up of some regulars of the Armée d'Afrique, the African troops, colonial troops, civilians, Jewish refugees from Europe, communist Spaniards, Arabs, on-the-fence Pétainistes. I mean, the whole political range was covered. A couple of things about the terminology. The word Corps Franc, when you think of Free Corps, usually it's associated with the Freikorps of the post-World War I era, when paramilitary units sort of coalesced to fight the Bolsheviks. But the French also have a tradition of free troops, non-regulars. That's the best way to translate it. It's irregulars. During the 1870 Franco-Prussian War, there were lots of people who fought behind the German lines. This is a very famous painting by Alphonse de Neuville about a peasant who is actually a spy and is about to be shot by the Germans, the Prussians. But there were several groups of volunteers who sort of coalesced out of nowhere to fight the Germans, but behind the lines. Those are some examples of those troops. They are not very well documented because, of course, they didn't leave a lot of documentations behind them, since the war was a disaster that didn't last, fortunately, too long. Those are, again, a few examples of the uniforms. They were very often, they inspired themselves, they were inspired by Garibaldi's red shirts from the Italian War of Independence, which was actually an all-volunteer irregular unit. If you talk about the corps franc and other free units, you always found the same person, Joseph Darnan. Darnan was a World War I hero. He had created a corps franc, which he called trench cleaners, nettoyeurs de tranchées, and they did a lot of damage, did coup de main type of attacks against German positions, a lot of prisoner taking, lots of things of that nature. Small, what you call today commando strikes. He was one of the most decorated soldiers in the French army in 1918. Unfortunately, during World War II, he became a die-hard collaborationist. He's seen here with Karl Obag, who was for a while head of the Gestapo in Paris. And Darnan created this unit, the Milice Française, the French militia, or Franc Garde, free, literally free guards, and free they were to do absolutely horrible things. They were responsible for lots of massacres of civilians. They were just about as bad as the SS. Another form of free units that should be mentioned, during the Second World War, you had a lot of organizations that were usually attached to the Communist Party, and they were referred to as FTP, Francs-Tireurs Partisans, irregular partisans. Okay, and there was also a particularly well-known group. The Manouchian group, they were FTP MOI. MOIs means main d'œuvre ouvrière, immigrant workers. And they were usually Jews from Central Europe. All of them were captured. They had to be photographed for German propaganda poster. It tells about the army of crime, to refer to those resistance fighters. They were all executed in 1942. So I need to give you a general idea of what the situation was like in North Africa around the time of the landings, Operation Torch. Because this lecture has a lot to do with the politics of North Africa, which the Allies did not understand. I think that the French didn't understand it clearly. All I can tell you is that it was a hot mess. I mean, and it was complicated by the fact that, for instance, for many American officers, that was their first contact with the French since the end of World War I. And for many younger soldiers, they really thought that the French could not, would not, and did not fight. There's that myth of the French surrendering in 1940 without firing a shot. That is completely untrue. That's propaganda made. Of course, they were completely whipped. But keep in mind that in 6 weeks, the French lost 90,000 men killed, and they didn't all die running. It was a hard campaign for the Germans. The idea that it was just a walk in the park, that's a myth. Actually, there is a reason why the Germans decided to not occupy southern France, because they didn't have the resources. But that's another story. So, who are the players? You have first Amiral Darlan. Darlan was the head of the French Navy, which was a very powerful navy at the time. The Allies were very, very concerned that this navy would join the Germans. So in July of 1940, they destroyed a French Navy base. The British destroyed a French Navy base in Mers el-Kébir in Algeria, which created a huge outpouring of anti-English hate, which was going to play out during the Darlan was very much a man representing Vichy government. Remember when the Germans conquered France, they installed a sort of puppet regime based in the city of Vichy in central France, and it was run by Marshal Philippe Pétain, that you have here in the right-hand side picture, with Darlan. And the official policy of the Vichy government was collaboration. As one of the prime ministers of Vichy France said, "I wish for Germany to win the war." That was very clear. Darlan was, however, not based in France proper. He tried to spend as little time as possible in Vichy. Most of his time was spent in North Africa, because North Africa was an area where France had major assets, populations, industries, what have you, and large armies. After the armistice of 1940, the French were only allowed to have an army of 100,000 men. Vichy's army. No heavy equipment, no airplanes, no nothing. It was essentially a glorified guard unit. And the thing is, in North Africa, you had all the North African troops, colonial troops and naval troops. I'll go back to that in a moment, but there were lots of assets, lots of equipment, lots of soldiers who were out of reach of the Germans, and the Germans tried to control them. They were never able to do that. The thing about Darlan is that he was very focused on succeeding Marshal Pétain, who was well into his 80s, and Darlan was really playing on all the possible cards he had, because he really wanted to become the new military dictator of France. As you will see in a few minutes, that didn't work out quite like that. Second very important character, General Giraud. General Giraud was a hero of World War I, and he was taken prisoner in 1940. He's on the left side of the center picture here. He was based in North Africa because he escaped Germany, he escaped a fortress, and made it to North Africa, where he found a refuge and decided to reorganize the army in order to go back into the fight. He was what you would call today a very mediatic man. Actually, there was a Gaullist operative who said, "Il est très Hollywood." He's very Hollywood, I quote. Most importantly, he has a reputation as a not very smart man that's completely undeserved. He was a man of the World War I generations. He did not really understand war as it was fought in 1940, 1942. But he was not a dunce. He was a very smart man, a patriot in his own way. And someone who paid a very, very steep price for his evasion and for his engagement in non-Vichy units, because his daughter died in a German concentration camp. The people who were trying to deal with North Africa, politically speaking, they really had a hard time sort of engaging in dialogues with the various French political movements and forces. In the lower picture here, you have, of course, Ike. You have Mark Clark on the left. Oh no, I'm sorry, on the right, And in the middle is Robert Murphy, who was the diplomat in charge of dealing with North Africa before the landings, before Operation Torch. Their favorite was clearly Giraud, as you can see by the top picture. But the Americans did not really understand the political equation that was developing in North Africa. They knew that they had to control North Africa because it would be from North Africa that Allied units would move into Sicily, Italy, and in 1944, southern France. So it was very important for Ike Eisenhower to control this area, but this area was extremely messy, politically speaking. And then, of course, we have, second from the right, we have Charles de Gaulle, who could not stand being in the same room as Giraud. They absolutely hated each other. De Gaulle had major ambitions. He represented Free France, La France Libre. You got to understand that in 1942, Free France was not a political force. Actually, it was sort of third in line, far behind the others. Free France was perceived as a completely inefficient, disorganized, and very small organization. And it was not entirely untrue, actually. Mostly because the Allies were very suspicious of de Gaulle's motivations and very suspicious of the men who followed de Gaulle. There was always that myth, and I don't know who started it, that de Gaulle's movement was full of communists, which is absolutely completely false. He had the hardest time getting the communist resistance, the FTPs that you saw earlier. He had the hardest time getting them to align with Free France, which they did in 1944. But that's another story. De Gaulle wanted to be the one representative of all of France, Free France. But at that time, he was number 3. Giraud was number 1. Darlan was number 2. And de Gaulle was number 3. Nobody really wanted to talk to him. He had to insist very heavily to be invited to the Casablanca conference. That picture here was taken in Casablanca a few months after Operation Torch. And there were many other players. There were Admiral Esteva, who had surrendered Tunisia to the Axis, General Mast, who was a sort of go-between, trying to determine who would come out on top between all those contenders. There was Nogues, who saw himself as a sort of viceroy of Morocco. But there were also people who were to illustrate themselves in the liberation of France as Free French, especially Generals Kultz and Juin. Juin made it to Field Marshal. People saw de Gaulle not as a soldier, but as a politician, and a dangerous one. One general that we'll mention again in a moment, in the 1950s, wrote in his memoir, "There are the politicians of yesterday who see de Gaulle as the restorer of a dead, collapsed republic, profiteers who want their cake and eat it too, supporters of Freemasonry." Those groups were seen as the worst danger for France. And we're talking about communists, Jews, and Freemasons. And de Gaulle was often perceived as the leader of this rabble of what was called at the time anti-France, anti-France. The issue was really to create or recreate a fighting army based in North Africa. In North Africa, the German armistice commissions had been unable to control, for instance, all the equipment. The French still had significant assets. That's a Samoa S-35 tank, which in 1940 was probably the best tank on the battlefield. The French had excellent tanks, as opposed to the reputation they acquired during the Battle of France. They had some of the best tanks in the world. The problem was doctrine, how they used those tanks, which was catastrophic. It's always said that the German used 3 groups of 1,000, and the French 3,000 groups of 3. 1,000 groups of 3. But they had military asset, aircraft as well, not many, and they had, of course, all the North African troops. These are Goumiers. Goum are mountain troops of Moroccan origin. They were extremely fierce fighters, and the French had a lot of those units. You'll see that they're going to play a part in the history of the Corps Franc. There were about, I think, as I recall, about 17 million Arabs, 3 million, 2.5, 3 million people of French descent. They were referred to as pieds noirs, black feet, literally. They were the French colons in North Africa. And also, there were about 200,000 refugees in Algeria alone. And you need to add to that Tunisia and Morocco. If you want to basically visualize the mess that was this area of the world, politically speaking, watch the movie Casablanca. That's exactly what it's about. People who are jockeying for position, people who are trying to, be on top of things, but it was a mess. Among those refugees, you also had a number of Spanish anarchists who had fought in the Spanish Civil War in the 30s, communists who escaped to Morocco at the end of the Civil War, Western and Eastern refugees, anti-German Nazis. You had a lot of Foreign Legion deserters. You always have a lot of French Legion deserters. It's a unit that creates a lot of deserters, mixing with the pieds noirs population and many demobilized Arabs who had, I think, an ulterior motive, which was to start preparing for independence. They saw World War II as a situation that could allow them to demand independence after the war, which is exactly what happened. But it turned into a war, as you know, 54 to 62, which was a tragedy for all parties involved. There were lots of very strange people operating in North Africa. I read in one book that the best intelligence service in North Africa at the time was organized by the Free Poles of a group called Rigor. The Free Poles. The French could not find their way out of the box, but the Poles had major assets in Free Poles had major assets in North Africa. The fact is also that there were lots of people in North Africa who were not particularly eager to be conscripted in the traditional French army, mostly because they had lost any type of confidence in the officers' corps, whom they blamed for the 1940 disaster, which is a little unfair. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's another topic. The fact is that many of the officers who were commanding troops in North Africa, most of them made it clear that they were still representatives of l'État français, the French state, the political and government entity under Pétain. Sorry. Give me 1 second. We are not absolutely sure where, when, and how, and by whom the idea of the corps franc was initiated. I think it was what you would call a sort of military grassroots movement. There seems to have been some sort of agreement between the Free French BCRA, which was the French intelligence service based in England, who did not trust at all the upper echelons of the Army and Navy, and the SOE, the Special Operation Executive, who opened a training center in Morocco just days after Operation Torch was effected. I think it's more than likely that there were links between SOE and the Free French. I haven't been able to document it. There are lots of documents pertaining to the the CFA that are not accessible. They are still classified as top secret, because anything that involves the resistance is still, a touchy issue. What we do know is that Giraud officially created the unit on November 25th, 1942. At that time, there were all sorts of soldiers in North Africa who didn't know what to do, essentially. The two pictures that you have here were taken just around the time of the creation of the corps franc. They were found, I found them in the archives, the military archives in Vincennes, in the 3 boxes full of documents that we're still going through with my friend Jean-Luc. They are 2 pictures that I found. As you can see on the right side, you have soldiers who are equipped with French uniforms. You see that one has a French flag on his arm. The other picture is very interesting because that's a little later. Obviously, everybody is wearing British uniforms, British battle dresses. And the woman in the center is the godmother of the corps franc. Her name was Françoise Roset. She was a very famous French actress. She was in movies until the 70s, early 70s. And Françoise Roset was interesting because she was in France, of course, at the beginning of the occupation. Because she was an actress, she had to sign a document going to the French Minister of Propaganda that she was not Jewish. And she categorically refused to sign that paper, which was an act of open resistance. And she was going to be arrested, and she managed to make it to Spain, because she was a star, and from Spain went into Morocco, and from Morocco to Tunisia. Of course, you also had North African troops, local troops, indigènes, as they were called at the time. Here, I like those 2 pictures because they show the transition for those North African soldiers. They were probably Goum. Goum being, like I said, those mountain troops, mostly recruited in Morocco, and you can see already that there's a real mess in terms of uniforms. They have French rifles, but if you look at the man on the right side of the picture, he's wearing a U.S. Army helmet liner. So clearly that was after Torch. The second picture was taken a little later when, as you can see, a lot of equipment went the way of the North African troops. You have here a Goum, a Moroccan soldier equipped with an M1 rifle. That was, of course, an absolute necessity for the corps franc to obtain weapons. And I think that's why they initially went towards the British, because the British, they knew, would transfer weapons to them. The Americans were lukewarm about transferring weapons and equipment to units like the Corps Franc because, again, they assumed that it was those units were full of communists. Initially, the Corps Franc, the CFA, was supposed to include about 6,000 men. That, of course, never happened. At most, there were 3 active battalions, understrength battalions, to which later were added naval light infantry and those goumiers that just showed you. At the height of its enrollment, the Corps Franc had about 2,000 men, and a few women, by the way, nurses. 2,000 men, but effective 1,600, never above that. The names of those men say it all. Captain Mikhailovich, Lieutenants Levy Beniluz, Ruslan Jambekov, Alexander Lichensky, Salva Di Porto, adjutant is like a senior sergeant, adjutant Giuseppe, adjutant chef Mohammed Ben Said and Yuda Ben Sadu, medical officers Ben Gigi and Turati. That is a good representation of the hodgepodge nature of the Corps Franc. Oops, sorry. Those volunteers were heavily influenced by what they had seen in terms of British and American, what you would call today special forces, to use a modern term, that had spearheaded the landings. British commandos, U.S. Army Rangers, paratroopers, both British and American. So the first commander that was chosen by Giraud to command the Corps Franc was Joseph Goualard de Montsabert. When you have a long name like this with de, it means nobility, aristocracy. He was from a very old aristocratic family that had given soldiers to France for centuries. He was, as you can see on the picture on the left, on the right, I'm sorry, picture on the right, you have here Goualard de Montsabert's staff, and you may note that they are wearing light-colored kepis, and they were referred to as the blue kepis. That is a significant thing, because the blue kepis were the officers of the North African troops, Armée d'Afrique, and they tended to be very conservative, very aligned on Vichy, very concerned about the presence of Muslim, Jewish, communist fighters in North Africa. The képi bleu were usually opposed to the képi noir, the black kepis of the colonial troops, who were less traditional, more inclined to enter the resistance and join the Gaullists, and younger. At the time, the French wanted to fight. Any number of people from all parts of the political spectrum wanted to fight. The phrase was casser du boche, to bust crowds, literally. But to do so, they needed modern equipment. They had no vehicles, they had no artillery, none of that. If they wanted to fight, they knew they had to somehow negotiate some sort of agreement with the Brits and the Americans. Actually, the British OSS created, SOE, apologize. The British SOE created a special detachment tasked with training the Corps Franc rabble in commando tactics, and also provided them some light weapons and equipment. And it was what the French called a marching unit, a small independent unit, like the one that was fighting coming from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa, the famous marching regiment of Chad that was commanded by a future Marshal of France, General Leclerc. When the Corps Franc was created, first it needed to be trained, and Goualard de Montsaber is the one who got the unit trained. But it became very obvious to him that the Corps Franc would be a bunch of misfits, composed of a bunch of misfits, and he decided to delegate the command to Joseph Magnan, who was a black kepi. He was not a blue kepi. So here are a couple of maps that I promised you. I'm going to be very, very brief about them. At that time, so at the beginning of 1943, when the Corps Franc became operational, the situation was that you had Allied troops coming from Morocco and Algeria, and then you had the 8th Army that was pushing west and north under, of course, Montgomery. At that point, 3 English divisions, or British divisions, the 46th, the 39th, and the 128th, were located in northern Morocco, and they were tasked to take Tunis, if possible, Bizerte, if Tunis was not an option. That didn't work very well. There were a lot of complaints of French officers about the way English officers refused to even interact with Free French soldiers, especially a Corps Franc, a semi-official unit, which didn't stop actually the Corps Franc that went in the field. It didn't stop the Corps Franc from actually securing the northern flank of the British forces, and they secured that. You can barely see it here. There is a coastal plain where the river known as Sedjenan, and the Sedjenan was key to controlling this part of the front. And the Corps Franc fought hard initially with very little results, but after a little bit more training and a little bit more fighting, they became operational in that area and were able to protect the British units. However, the British units were unable to move much further and faster, and they were not able to capture Bizerte or Tunis, for that matter. That mission of, mission of covering either the flanks or the rear of Allied units, that became sort of the hallmark of the Corps Franc d'Afrique. Now, here you have the situation at the beginning of 42, the spring of 42. What you had was those areas in central Morocco which were controlled by Americans, but of course that's the area of El Guetar and Kasserine, which, as you know, were attacked, 2 locations attacked by the Germans, who really punched a serious hole in American forces. The hole was filled, the front, in spite of heavy casualties, the front held, but it sort of stabilized at the same time. And what General Alexander, who was in charge of that, the British officer who was in charge of that area, the way Alexander decided to operate a very risky operation. He had all those English and British units that were in northern Tunisia. He moved them south, while at the same time the American forces were moving north to sort of replace the British operational troops. It was mostly the 1st Infantry Division, the 1st Armored Division, and very important, the 9th Infantry Division. Which is why the Corps Franc, which was actually in position to do so in the Sejenan area, the Corps Franc was assigned the task of protecting the northern flank of the 9th Infantry Division, and was essentially under American command, which was sort of unusual at the time because French officers wanted U.S. equipments and U.S. guns and U.S. rifles and what have you, but they did not particularly want to be commanded by American officers. Fortunately, the man who commanded the 9th Infantry Division, Manton Eddy, one of Eisenhower's most capable generals in North Africa and later, Manton Eddy was able to convince the commanders of the CFA to become essentially under their command. In the French visual archives, it's called the INA, I found one very, very short clip of that was filmed around that time, and as you can see, there is in the center there is a British officer. On the right, you have an officer, looks like either a major or a lieutenant colonel of the 9th Infantry Division. You see his flower shoulder patch. And you have one French soldier which is far left. If it's a French soldier interacting with a 9th Infantry Division staff or field officer, it's very likely that this was a member of the Corps Franc d'Afrique. Who knows, it might have been El Ghazi himself, since he was a liaison officer. The 9th Infantry Division, by the way, was one of the best in the Western European front. It went all the way to Torgau on the Elbe River, where they connected. They were the first American unit to connect with Soviet troops in '45. That's another story. In terms of sources, there are a couple of books that I found that are sort of interesting about the 9th Infantry Division. There's a 2-volume memoir by a former captain. His name was Gerard Phillips. He was with the 47th Regiment of the 9th Infantry Division. And the second volume is really about the Battle of Sejenan. Calls it the payoff battle leading to the capture of Bizerte, Tunisia, by the 9th Infantry Division. There's also a regimental history called 8 Stars to Victory. I've been able to actually locate a copy of that by a Captain Middleman. So those sources don't talk a lot about the Corps Franc. There are some mentions to it. I found several notes about Manton Eddy speaking favorably of the Corps Franc, but I have not been able to secure the exact citations. But that certainly didn't stop the Corps Franc from protecting and moving forward, protecting the northern flank of the 19th Infantry Division and forging east in the direction of Bizerte. Like I said, I don't want to turn this into a tactical history, but essentially here you have the map that shows the progression of the 9th Infantry Division in a very, very mountainous area. The mountain troops, the French mountain troops, the Goumier, in his book, The War as I Knew It, General Patton says, yeah, there are those French troops. They sound like goons. The name was Goum. It's an Arabic term that means essentially troop or section. And as you can see, the Corps Franc is on the northern flank of the 47th Infantry Regiment. They were very useful because, if nothing else, they were extremely familiar with the terrain, and it was a difficult and dangerous terrain to acquire and to defend because the Germans were not inactive and they counterattacked on a number of occasions. So here we have a slight difference of opinions. The French side of the story is that on May 7th, they were the first French unit to enter Bizerte as a flanking unit, also accompanied by naval light infantry under Major Bouvet, who was to illustrate himself in Indochina and the Delta campaign. The American official side of the story is that the battle, the first unit to enter the city was an American armored battalion. The divisional history indicating that political reasons, and I quote, contributed to the CFA's purported liberation of Bizerte. I think that probably Giraud asked Eisenhower to let the French unit enter the city, the harbor of Bizerte. Which is also what happened essentially with the liberation of Paris. American Allied forces were supposed to bypass Paris, but de Gaulle, who had in the meantime become the leader of Free France, asked Eisenhower to let a French division, the 2nd Armored Division, enter Paris first, which they did. I'll go back to that in a moment. You'll understand why.
Hey, Laurent, let me interrupt real quick. I'm so sorry, and I apologize to you, and I apologize to you, Laurent. We can continue the program, but I'm going to have to get the TV up here in about 5 minutes because there's a celebration of life at the other end, and they need the TV to show the photos, of the person, So, and they got to have that by 2 o'clock.
2 o'clock. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm almost done.
Okay.
Okay,
All right,
I'm going to accelerate a little bit.
sorry, Laurent.
No, that's no problem. You told me initially. What you have here is, of course, the prisoners of war that were captured in Bizerte and Tunis. Tunis was captured by troops coming from the south, and they captured about 230,000 Axis soldiers. So the Germans referred to the battle as Tunisgrad. According to El Ghazi, the Corps Franc men and women were not part of the celebration and did not hear the ovations of the crowd. They did not pick up the flowers thrown at them. They were crushed under their poorly coordinated steps. The men of the CFA realized that they did not have the glibness, in fact, the handsomeness of the Saxons and Vikings who marched before them with the elegance borrowed from the heroes of Western movies. And on June 25, the unit was dissolved by Giraud, whose comment was, "I am not satisfied with you." At the time it was dissolved, the Corps Franc, the 3rd Battalion, was described as follows: 25% AWOL, worn out boots, no tents, 1 jeep, 4 trucks of unknown origin and in bad shape. Okay. The Corps Franc in action lost 691 men, including 391 killed. They fought, and they fought hard. Many of them, that's the Liberation Parade in Tunis. You have here a Free French unit that is flying its flag, choosing its camp. What's important is that many of the men who left the Corps Franc reappear in other Free French units, especially units like the African commandos that were being trained for the next landing. They didn't go into Italy, but they went into France in August of 44. And many of the men who were part of the Corps Franc started interacting with others. Oops. People like Captain Drone, famous Captain Drone, who will end up being the first French unit to enter Paris in 44. He was the commander of the 9th company of the Régiment de Marche du Tchad, the marching regiment of Chad, and most of his men in that company were Spaniards. It was referred therefore as La Nueve, the 9th company, and they most of them were from the Corps Franc. And they continued interacting with people like Jacques Paris de la Bollardière, who did not die in 61. I'm sorry, that's a typo. Jacques Paris de la Bollardière became one of the great officers. He went into the SAS and participated in the development of the French airborne arm. Very important character, because during the Algerian War in 1961, that's probably because I have 61, he resigned his general's commission to protest the use of torture by the French in North Africa. There are many others. I'm not going to bother you with details. But what's important, and I'll close here, is that the men of the CFA that went into the regular army very much carried the DNA of that first special unit in the French service. And you find many of those officers, like Michel Legrand, almost a mythical officer. The DNA finds itself in other special unit troops, such as the Commando Aéroporté, airborne commandos, in Indochina, and the hunting commandos in North Africa. And it's not a thing that is gone. That DNA is still there. This is the current flag of the Régiment de Marche du Tchad, and here you have the Commando Marine, who were originally trained by the Brits and are probably the best special forces in the French army. So I'm done here. Just one interesting detail, just to close the talk. There is a new book by Lawrence Friedman. I haven't read, but a friend of mine has alerted me to the fact. It's called The Politics of Military Operations from Korea to Ukraine. The Corps Franc, if nothing else, shows the difficulty of connecting politics and military affairs, but the French became sort of specialists of that, and for a long time that influenced American policy, especially in terms of counterinsurgency warfare. There's a very famous officer, Roger Tranquier, who became sort of the great theoretician of counterinsurgency warfare in the 50s and 60s, and he is still read at the Military Staff College. So anyway, I just wanted to tell you about those people who fought honestly and courageously, and I hope that we can create a book someday that will acknowledge their memory. Thank you.
Hey, Laurent, while they come grab the TV, why don't you take some questions? We can go ahead and disconnect the TV. They can grab it, and then if anyone's got any questions.
Actually, before I take questions, I'd like to acknowledge someone in the room.
Oh, go ahead.
There's one person I consider extremely important in this room. I'm glad he's here today. It's that young man right here. What's your name? I'm sorry?
Caleb.
Caleb, okay. How old are you? 11. Okay. That's a very important member of the group because he's the next generation. He is going to be carrying the torch. I find it immensely sad that you're going to grow up in a country where there are no more World War II veterans. But what's important is that you're in a position to remember them, and that makes you extremely important. So to acknowledge that, if that's okay with your dad, do you have an email address? If it's okay with your dad, I'd like to take your email address and your mailing address, and I'm going to get you a 1-year membership to the Society for Military History. It's not about World War II specifically, it's about all wars everywhere from ancient antiquity to next week. Perhaps that will make you feel like reading more about military history. Please don't become a college professor, it's not that much fun. But maybe you'll find yourself, wanting to be a scholar. The journal that goes with the membership is a little dry, it's scholarship, but if you learn a couple of things, and if that makes you want to sort of grow your knowledge of military affairs, that's the best journal to read.